The night before we were to close out the Chicago play date, Rick collapsed on stage. He'd been looking pale and clammy most of the afternoon and gulping down aspirin by the handful, but he kept getting worse. It turned out to be appendicitis. They got him to the hospital in time to save his life, just barely from the sound of things, but it was so close that the doctors told us he was going to be out of commission for at least 2 months, maybe more. In the end, it was decided that it just wasn't worth the hassle of trying to break in a new guitarist. The remaining play dates on the tour were rescheduled, and the tour proper was simply postponed for the duration of Rick's convalescence. Like it or not, we had 2 months of downtime ahead of us, maybe more. Personally, I've never gotten along well with enforced idleness. If I'm going to goof off, it has to be my own idea, or I just can't relax and enjoy it decently. I usually end up stressed out, worse than if I hadn't tried to relax at all. And now, all of a sudden, I was staring at 60 days of nothing to do but absolutely nothing. 1,440 hours of sitting around twiddling my thumbs when I was all wired up to perform. 86,400 of what should have been gloriously serene, blissful minutes that I was going to end up grinding my way through like a feed mill chewing kernels of dried corn into cornmeal. The entire notion grated on my nerves. But there was nothing else to do except maybe rattle around Chicago like a marble in a coffee can, and the weather just then was too cold and windy for me to even consider doing that. So I made the best of things. I got on the phone, rented a beach house in Malibu by long distance, booked a flight, coaxed Rocky into his cat carrier, and the next day I was settling my backside onto warm California beach sand. I sighed as I felt it grit up into my back, all warm and prickly. If I had to kick back and relax against my will, better to do it someplace warm and comfortable, right? I'll say this for the beach. The environment and the sound of the surf can be amazingly soothing. I drifted off in a matter of minutes. And I was dreaming again. In the dream, I was still lying on that same beach, just drowsing and enjoying the sunshine and the roar of the surf. There was no detectable transition between waking and sleeping, so I wasn't even aware that I was dreaming. Voices intruded on my awareness, familiar voices. I aroused, still feeling groggy, and turned over toward the sound of those voices, and found Wish and Tommy coming up the beach toward me, wading along the surf line, knee-deep in the water. They suddenly stopped dead and turned out toward the ocean, staring up at the sky. Fear washed across their faces. I turned to look at whatever they were reacting to and found a huge black blot high in the sky. It was descending toward them with terrifying speed. It had an uncomfortably bat-like shape, and it had an air of horrible skin-crawling menace to it. I didn't know how I knew it, but I knew, just as surely as if it were wearing a sign flashing its intent out in neon letters, that it meant to kill Wish and her brother. Wish screamed and turned to run up the beach toward me. She'd barely gotten underway when the bat shadow thing swooped down over Tommy. Where the shadow of the thing swept across him, all the details of Tommy's form seemed to erase, moving up from his feet to the top of his head in the space of a split second, like someone letting a window shade snap up. When it passed, the only thing left of Tommy was a kind of blank, featureless outline of a human being, moving like a marionette with half its strings cut. The shadow chased Wish up on the beach, slowing as it caught up to her. I came to my feet, screaming in wordless protest and anguish, knowing that I was about to see my green-eyed ocean lady erased from existence like an etch-a-sketch drawing. And then the blot thing swerved aside at the last instant, swooped around in front of Wish, placing itself between her and me, and settled to the sand. I could see Wish through it, half obscured by its darkness, backpedaling frantically in the poor footing of the sand as she struggled to keep from crashing into it. Just as she managed to break to a halt, the blot of shadow began to dwindle, darkening and solidifying as it shrank. In the time it took me to blink once, the blot of shadow condensed itself into the form of a large man clad in black. He lunged toward Wish, fingers clawed as if to rip her to bloody shreds. "Excuse me." I woke up with a jolt that almost tore my stomach from its moorings. A stranger towered over me. He was tall, muscular, dark-haired, steely-eyed, and pasty-skinned. He dressed all in black, the sort of clothing someone would wear in that kind of sweltering summertime environment only if he suffered from a medical condition that left him feeling cold all the time, even in a warm climate, or he enjoyed playing tag with heat stroke. I noticed about him a darkness that hovered about him, like a thin, swirling fog. I blinked uncertainly. I wasn't exactly seeing it with my eyes, but it was there. I could perceive it somehow. I remembered those odd times when I'd seen shifting glows of colored light around some people that seemed to have nothing to do with the lighting conditions around them, and I wondered if these were the auras I'd heard tell of. And now I found myself wondering fleetingly if this was an aura too. The problem was, everything I'd seen and heard about the subject indicated that auras were characterized by colors and light, and this cloud of whatever it was dark, completely devoid of color, and it felt faintly, loathsomely cold where it brushed up against my skin. I realized with a jolt that this was almost exactly the same sort of shadowy thing I'd seen swooping down on Wish and Tommy in my dream. And that set off alarm bells in my head, loud ones. I had to work hard not to show my reactions outwardly, though. Something just told me that showing them to this character would be a really bad mistake. In alarm, I saw that he was holding Rocky up to me by the scruff of the neck, and Rocky was squalling in pain, but strangely, he wasn't really struggling to get free. That made no sense whatsoever. The little guy gotten caught in a barbed wire fence as a kitten and torn the back of his neck up. It had never healed properly. Picking him up by the scruff was an invitation to get shredded into bleeding sushi because picking him up there hurt. He loved and trusted me, so he'd tolerate me picking him up by the scruff as long as there was no other way for me to get a hold of him, but not for more than a few seconds. Let anyone else pick him up that way, and he'd do his best to shred the offending hand to steak tartare. Yet he was just dangling from this dark stranger's hand, squalling in pain and squirming spastically, but making no effort to scratch him and get free, almost as if he'd been drugged. I also noticed that the darkness around the man was clustered most thickly around Rocky. It seemed to be trying to choke the life out of him. Part of me bristled like a growling dog at all this, but the prudent part of me, the one warning me not to show my true reactions to this stranger, covered it over and made me act as if nothing were wrong, as if this were just some ordinary everyday encounter and I was just some airhead valley boy surfer dude. I wasn't sure why, mind you, but the warning was too strong to ignore. So I just scrambled to my feet, blinked at him sleepily, as if I had no clue to what was going on, and gulped, "Huh?" He raised Rocky casually, at arm's length, as if he were weightless. Not an easy thing to do with a cat that weighs almost 15 pounds. And with a perfectly straight, almost blank face, asked, "Is this yours?" Traces of a British accent clung to his words. Something about that set my hackles to bristling all over again. Sternly, I ordered them to cease and desist, and to my surprise, they settled down, reluctantly but surely. Yeah." I took Rocky from him quickly. He was suffering, and I couldn't stand that. but putting my hand into that darkness around Rocky made my skin crawl, like I put it into a swamp or an open sewer. "Oh, sorry, man, he been bugging you or something?" I actually managed to sound slightly brain damaged. I felt a flicker of perverse pride at that for some reason. The corners of his mouth bent upward in what was obviously intended to be a smile, but it didn't spread any farther than that. A real smile spreads all the way across the face, and even the eyes get involved in it. This smile of his was nothing more than a facial accessory. No other part of his face got involved in the matter in any way, and his irises near white, well, those were as cold and dead as last week's fish market special. Whatever was looking out of them at me wasn't human, no matter what surface appearances said. I began to understand why that unnamed part of me was prompting me to play dumb and innocent. Whoever or whatever this character was, he was dangerous in ways I wasn't capable of understanding yet. For lack of a more accurate term, man held out a hand politely and murmured, "Nicodemus Castevet, I'm your neighbor. I own a number of parrots, and the cat was prowling about. It gave them quite a fright." Something about having that hand approach me set off alarms all over the inside of my head. That unnamed part of me backed away from that hand as if it were red hot, making it very clear that I was not to touch it no matter what. Now, I've always prided myself on my good manners. Mom and Dad were very strong on proper manners and common courtesy, and they made sure I turned out that way too. If not for that, and what I could perceive of this thing's true nature, I probably would have taken a swing at him for mistreating Rocky the way he had. It was a good thing I didn't give in to my baser instincts. I found out later that people and things who attacked Nicodemus Castevet had a way of coming up missing or found dead and mutilated. Instead, I took the high road, and Mom and Dad would have been proud of me. I concentrated on comforting Rocky, pretending not to notice the outstretched hand and hoping he'd take the hint and remove it. "Oh, sorry, man. He must have slipped out of the house when I came out here. I'll keep a closer eye on him from now on." "Because God knows what you'd do to him if you ever got your hands on him again, you, whatever you are." I knew for a fact that Rocky had been inside the beach house when I'd left. I'd seen him curled up on the living room sofa when I closed the patio door behind myself. I never let him out to wander in strange places because it's just too dangerous. Cats are too curious for their own good, and when they find themselves in a new place, they can't help but go exploring. And strange places all too often have teeth bigger than an unsupervised cat can survive. Either someone had gotten into the house while I was asleep and left the door open, or this Castevet character had gotten in and grabbed Rocky for some reason. Just what, I wasn't sure, but considering what I could tell of him, I wouldn't have put it past him. That unnamed part of me commented something to the effect that it wouldn't have put the Holocaust past him either. And the scary thing about it was, it sounded like it knew what it was talking about. Castevet looked as though he were considering saying something else, but hesitated. He searched my face for a moment, seeming to be puzzled at not finding something there that he'd been expecting to find. Then finally backed away a step and turned to leave, murmuring, "Yes, see that you do that." As he walked away, Rocky finally managed to regain enough physical control and courage to growl at him. Castevet glanced back in mid-stride and fastened those cold, colorless eyes on Rocky. The growl died with a curious hiccuping sound, and Rocky began shivering violently. Something about Castevet scared my cat so badly that he wouldn't even run away from him. Even if I'd had no psychic leanings of any sort, that alone would have told me that this Castevet character was bad news in spades. Animals may not be as smart as humans in a lot of ways, but I believed for a long time that they're all telepathic to some extent, and it's almost impossible to fool an animal about your nature. If you're a good person, they know it, and if you're mean and nasty right clear through, 99.99% of the animals you meet are going to avoid you like the plague because they know what you are the minute they lay eyes on you. Castevet's eyes flicked away from Rocky as though he had no meaning whatsoever in the world, and he strode away up the beach. I concentrated on Rocky for a few minutes. He really needed calming and loving. His eyes were dilated wide in that way that says a cat's trying to go into shock, and he needed to be eased out of the state before I ended up with a dead pet on my hands. I scratched his ears and chin and murmured to him and just generally let him know that he was safe and loved, and he finally began to relax and look around uncertainly. When I finally managed to get him to relax enough to begin purring again, I started back to the house and froze in my tracks. I just happened to glance down to make sure there was nothing dangerous down there to step on in my bare feet, and noticed something that made the hair all over my body stand straight up. The only tracks in the sand were mine. The path I'd taken down from the house was clearly visible. The place where I'd been lying in the sand was obvious. The disturbance in it, where I'd gotten up to my feet to retrieve Rocky from Castevet, was plain as day down there around my feet. But there were no other signs of anyone else having walked through this area for at least 2 days. The place where Castevet had been standing was undisturbed. The route he'd taken when he'd walked away up the beach toward the house just to the north of mine was equally unmarked. I took a deep, shaking breath. Castevet hadn't been an illusion. Rocky's presence and emotional condition was indisputable proof of that. So, how had he walked across all that sand without leaving any footprints? I hurried back to the house, put down a warm saucer of Rocky's special kitty cat milk to help settle his poor frayed nerves, and then headed for the bathroom. I needed a shower. Bad. In particular, the hand with which I'd retrieved Rocky from inside that dark miasma that had surrounded Castevet felt like it needed to be scrubbed down with toilet bowl cleanser.
I was chillin' at the beach thinking I was out of reach. I was dozing by the shore, working up a little snore. Here comes a in my face, shaking up the place. Now don't call me a fool, but he looked like a ghoul. He was dressed all in black and ready to attack. Here comes a in my face, shaking up the place. He got a hold of my cat and I should have knocked him flat, but I sensed he was scum, so I played real dumb. Here comes a in my face, shaking up the place. He said, "My name is Castevet. Would you please confine your pet? I live next door and I've got parrots galore." Here comes the in my face, shaking up the place. So I said, okay, and then he walked away. He was the in my face, shaking up the place. Castevet's eyes flicked away from my cat as though he had no meaning whatsoever in the world, and he strode away up the beach. I started back to the house and froze in my tracks. I just happened to glance down and noticed something that made the hair all over my entire body stand straight up. The only tracks in the sand were mine.